Welcome back, everybody, to session 2, Blue Forests and Climate Change. To introduce session 2, I'm handing over to Cecilia. Please, Cecilia.
Thank you for that introduction, Gabriella. As you mentioned, we're now going to move on to the second theme for today's session, which is blue forests and climate change. Blue forests are increasingly recognized for their climate change adaptation and mitigation potential. And as Solveig mentioned, they featured really prominently at the last COP. In the first half of this session, we're going to hear from 3 speakers. We're then going to have a panel discussion before I pass the moderator baton on to my colleague, Peter Haugen. But before that, I want to remind everyone to, if you have questions, please submit them via the app Slido. That includes people in the audience as well, so that you can also be part of the panel discussions. And I also want to just have a kind of light start to the day by showing a little video to get you more familiar with one of the key blue forest ecosystems. So here's a short video before we get started. So that was a light warm-up to get you back in your seats and to not scare you off. And now we're going to take a deeper dive. And our first speaker is Karen Philby-Dexter. Karen is a researcher with the Institute for Marine Research, and she leads several research projects on climate change and kelp. And we've asked her to help us get a better understanding of just how important blue forests are for climate change. So we're going to hear from her right now.
So hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So the majority of natural climate solutions, so this is actions that involve managing, or restoring ecosystems to address carbon-related and climate change-related challenges, have been primarily focused on land. These include a number of initiatives to increase our terrestrial forests and to sort of regrow our carbon sinks on land. But we do know that most carbon storage is actually happening in the ocean. And there's increasing awareness that vegetated coastal habitats are sites of intense carbon storage. So there's more focus on these habitats as blue carbon solutions. And blue carbon ecosystems traditionally include mangroves and saltmarshes and seagrass beds. These ecosystems accumulate and they store organic carbon, as well as provide a number of other ecosystem services. So they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in living biomass, and also sequester it into the sediments and the marine sediments that these ecosystems are growing on. So the part of the carbon production that's incorporated into these sediments every year is actually stored out of the carbon cycle in the long term. So we know that these ecosystems are removing carbon at a globally relevant scale, and that they're fixing this CO2 in the long term, and that management is also possible to maintain these stocks, as well as to increase the sequestration rates. The other ecosystem that I'm going to be talking about today, which meets most of these criteria, is macroalgae. But there are some interesting unknowns about the fate of some of the macroalgal carbon. So these are your kelp forests and your other seaweed forests. This is the global state of our blue carbon ecosystems. So these are the most recent numbers on the extent, so they're covering millions of hectares. And then the per area standing biomass in terms of a carbon stock, the per area sequestration rate, so how much carbon these ecosystems are actually burying inside the sediment or soil, and then the sort of global sequestration rate that these ecosystems make up. So one thing just to highlight with these numbers is that there's a really large range for these per area rates. So, for example, mangroves going from 79 to 2,000 tons of carbon per hectare. And this just shows that different ecosystems, depending on where you are in the world, can have wildly different carbon sequestration capacity. The other thing just to highlight is that on sort of a global level, the extent of your kelp and seaweed forest is very large compared to these other ecosystems, but there's also a lot of error associated with some of those sequestration estimates. And in total, all of these blue forest ecosystems are capturing between 0.1 and 1 gigaton of carbon per year. And just to put this in context, the global fossil fuel emissions are 36 gigatons of carbon. And although we have sort of the current status of blue carbon, it's important to highlight that all of these ecosystems have been in decline over the last half century, and they're continuing to decline. All models are showing they'll continue to decline into the future. We also know that the pathways and the rates of carbon storage are changing. This is due to range expansions or losses due to climate change. It's due to shifts with sea level rise, which can actually cause some blue carbon habitats to release their stored carbon, and also changes in dominant vegetation or fauna. And I just wanted to highlight how the three blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, seagrass, and salt marshes, are actually quite analogous to terrestrial forests in how they're cycling carbon. So they all have a standing stock or above and below ground biomass. And then every year, they're actually accumulating and burying carbon within these ecosystems and within the soil. And in contrast, the seaweed forests, or your kelp forests, are really behaving much differently, much more similar to phytoplankton sinks in the open ocean. So these ecosystems have a large amount of productivity, and a portion of that annual productivity does not get consumed in the coastal zone, does not decompose in the coastal zone, but instead is exported away from these shallow, well-lit environments and into deep sink areas where it can take a long time for that carbon to break down and re-enter the atmosphere, hundreds to thousands of years. So in this way, they're actually bringing CO2 from the coastal zone and from the atmosphere into deep carbon sinks. And I should say that that disjunct between the habitat and the site of carbon sequestration can cause some issues in how you include seaweed forests in policy. But researchers are actually working on global models of seaweed production. They're modeling the export of carbon to ocean sinks, and all of this information is helping refine sequestration estimates on a regional and global level. Blue forests do not only provide carbon storage, they also provide a suite of other co-benefits. And key ones here are coastal protection from floods and storms, as well as fishery provision by providing habitat and important nursery areas for a number of commercial or recreational subsistence fisheries. And this is nicely highlighted here, this infographic just shows the number of SDGs that kelp forest ecosystems are actually contributing to. Some quite directly, such as life below water and responsible consumption, whereas others more indirectly. But all in all, protecting and restoring and managing these ecosystems can really contribute valuable solutions to our current climate and societal crises. And thank you so much for having me today. And it would be really great to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Karen, for that really useful introduction and also for reminding us of how blue forests are important, not just for climate change, but so many of the SDGs and also, as we're talking about today, food security. We're going to have a chance to ask her questions during the panel. She'll join us live on screen from Australia then. But first, I want us to take a step back and just reflect on a key fact. If we want to enjoy the many blue forest ecosystem services, be it climate change or food security or all the others, we have to stop and hopefully reverse the decline of blue forests. And to help us to know more about the extent to which blue forests are declining, why and what we can do about it, we're going to hear from Hege Gundersen. Hege is a senior research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. She is a biologist and an expert on blue forest ecosystem functions and services. So please, let's welcome Hege to the stage.
Thank you, Cecilia. Yes, I will give an overview of the major threats to blue forests and all their services, and also go into some ways to address them. Unfortunately, as and not surprising, and as you have heard, blue forests are in decline globally. The numbers you see here is what we have been able to confirm from existing literature. But of course, not all blue forests and not all countries by far are mapping and monitoring their blue forests. So these are approximate numbers. And there is great knowledge gaps in many parts of the world. Overall, more than 25% of mangrove forests have been lost since 1980. And what remains is often in poor condition. We do see that the rate of decline is slowing down globally, but in particular in Southeast Asia, the loss is still very high. When it comes to salt marshes, as much as 25 to 50% of the coverage have been lost the last century. And sadly, we are expecting even higher loss rates due to sea level rise the coming years. For seagrass meadows, there has been a 29% loss since the 19th century, especially in low latitudes. Seagrass is at risk due to high temperatures and heat waves. But also, current projections suggest that the distribution of seagrass will probably increase towards the poles in the coming decades in response to climate change. So at least there are some good news. As much as 40 to 60% of kelp forests have declined over the past decades, and still kelp abundances are declining with 1.8% every year. Also for kelp, we do expect some expansion towards the colder end of its natural distribution area, but this is not enough to compensate for what is happening in the warmer end. As you see here, the list of different threats to blue forests is long. Many different processes are at play, operating at local and global scales, often causing a range of direct and indirect effects. But also some are common to all ecosystems and to all regions. For instance, climate changes. That somewhat affects everything, everywhere. Climate changes work through increased temperatures, heat waves, and other extreme events. More runoff from land, bringing nutrients and particles that darkens the water. And many of these threats work together as so-called multiple stressors, which often worsens the combined effect. And also, their interactions can be very complex. Fishery can affect the ecosystem physically, for instance by trawling, or through overfishing and what we call trophic cascades down the food web. Logging and harvesting can overexploit the forests if not done sustainably. Agriculture can cause eutrophication and cause blooms of competing species. Coastal development can affect directly through replacement of area or through indirect effects of human presences. There are too many different threats to go deeply into each one of them here today, but I will mention a few examples on the coming slides. Mangrove. The greatest threat to the world mangrove forest is probably the rapidly expanding shrimp aquaculture industry. Thousands of acres have been cleared to make room for artificial ponds for shrimp cultivation. These activities are not only replacing existing mangrove forests, but also affecting surrounding forests by depriving them for water. Historically, the major threat to salt marshes has been replacement for agriculture or urban construction. But currently, the major threats include climate change effects and pollution. Being situated in the coastal zone, often in areas with large tidal ranges, the large amount of coastal marine litter combined with climate changes, such as more frequent storms, can result in situations you see at this picture. When it comes to seagrasses, I've chosen to focus on the direct impact or physical impact of humans living or having their activities in the sheltered bays and lagoons, exactly the same place where you find most seagrass beds. On this drone photo, you see some light green circles around some white spots. The white spots are leisure boats anchoring up in seagrass beds, and the light green are areas where seagrass is scraped away due to the anchor chains. Many of the different threats to kelp forests are ultimately linked to climate change and very often interact in their effects. A common example is kelp forests overgrown by turf algae, which is caused by high loads of nutrients in combination with high temperatures. This situation can also be caused by overfishing through trophic cascade down the food web. So what can we do? What is for sure, with these rather dark scenarios, we have to do something to stop the decline and take care of what remains in our blue forests. And therefore, we are welcoming the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. But even though we call it the Decade of Restoration, it's important not to restrict our actions against only restoring what is already lost. It's even more important to protect what is not yet gone and thereby prevent further losses. If a blue forest is not sufficiently protected, then the next step is restoration. If it's not possible to restore, then it has to be replaced. But keep in mind that it is so much easier and cost-effective to protect than to recreate something that has been lost. Here are some examples. You see that there are possible ways to restore all these blue forests. Mangrove, we have seen earlier today, there have been a lot of good examples and successful stories. Seagrass can also be restored very much in the same way, but it's very cost-effective. Not cost-effective. Saltmarshes on the picture is from Denmark. It's a huge area that they have opened for seawater running over and creating agricultural land towards saltmarsh meadows. And here you see a picture of kelp spores on small stones called green gravel, which is a way to restore kelp forest where it is gone, to help the seeds establish. But it's important here to note that if the reason for why the kelp wasn't there is not in the first place, then this is not a very useful way to solve the problem. Well, that is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Hege. Those were some really beautiful pictures you showed for us, and thank you for explaining it so simply and so to the point. We will hear from Hege also in the panel, so if you have any questions, please do send them in. But first, we're going to have one more speaker. she'll be joining us digitally. It is Angelique Popano. Angelique is a lawyer, an ocean and climate advisor, and is currently doing a PhD on carbon financing. She will share with us how the Seychelles is embracing blue forests in its updated nationally determined contributions. So, for those not familiar, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are each country's individual climate action plans. Back in 2016, Grid Arendal and their partners undertook a study of the first round of NDCs that came out after the Paris Agreement. Already then, they found that 28 countries reference coastal wetlands in their mitigation plans, whilst an even greater number, 59 countries, included coastal ecosystems in their adaptation strategies. And we're seeing now, with countries revising and updating their NDCs, an even stronger focus on blue forests. Of the countries that have given a new or revised NDC, about 2/3 have included provisions to protect and restore blue carbon ecosystems. So this is becoming increasingly an area that we are recognizing. So let's take a closer look at what the Seychelles is doing in this regard.
Greetings, everyone. As already mentioned, my name is Angelique Pouponneau, and I will be sharing with you the experience of the Seychelles as it relates to the inclusion of blue forests within its NDCs. Now, the government of Seychelles, of course, has an obligation under the Paris Agreement to prepare, submit its nationally determined contribution. So, you know, for sort of the non-climate folks in the room, their climate plans. And in order to do this, it collaborated with several partners, and this is just a few on the opening slide here. And several partners came together in collaboration to help Seychelles integrate blue carbon, blue forests within its nationally determined contributions. As you can see, the actors varied from the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust that played a central coordinating function, the Island Conservation Society, the University of Seychelles, German Aerospace Center, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the University of Oxford. So what was in Seychelles' nationally determined contribution commitments towards blue forest? I think many of you have already seen this within the nationally determined contributions, but essentially very bold steps as it relates in particular to seagrass and mangrove ecosystems. The first is a commitment to fully map the extent of mangroves and seagrass ecosystems and conducting a first-time assessment of seagrass carbon stocks within Seychelles waters. The second, a commitment to protect these blue carbon ecosystems and identifying quantitative measures, quantitative indicators of protection. So here talking about protecting at least 50% of seagrass and mangrove ecosystems by 2025 and 100% of seagrass and mangrove ecosystems by 2030. Always good to go back to the text. You will see that it is, of course, through the marine spatial planning process established in the Seychelles. And finally, establishing a long-term monitoring program for seagrass habitats and including the nation's blue carbon ecosystems within Seychelles' nationally greenhouse gas inventory by 2025. So first off, thinking about the mapping. So this is actually in progress, and of course, quite a lot has already been done, and you'll see the photos to follow. But what we started with was a remote sensoring process using partners like the German Aerospace, and then partnering with local stakeholders on the ground to ground truth, to really validate if what the satellites were seeing were in fact there. This will then be analyzed with the support of the University of Oxford, as well as other partners, to ascertain just how much carbon is being absorbed by the seagrass meadows of the Seychelles. This will then subsequently influence and inform policy decisions from then on about seagrass meadows. I won't go too much into these slides. I'm not a scientist, but I think the photos are great. And as you can see here, there's evidence of some carbon coring that is taking place in the Seychelles. Again, ground truthing, there were multiple ways of doing it from cameras as well as the cores. The next part of the commitment is to protect. Now, when it comes to protection, it's very important that we think about what we need in order to garner the support of protection if it's to go through a marine spatial planning process. The marine spatial planning process is consultative, it involves everyone around the table, and therefore it's important to establish why is it we must protect these ecosystems. And here, as part of the initiative, there were initiatives, there were activities that were to engage the community so that we would be able to raise awareness about the importance of this ecosystem. One fantastic initiative, I think, is where we realized that there was no Creole word for the word of seagrass. And with that, it meant there was an exercise where it was crowdsourced, a word was crowdsourced through multiple consultations to finally identify a Creole word for 5 life forms of seagrass that has now officially become part of the Creole dictionary. Again, raising awareness through a multitude of activities, including poetry competition amongst young people, engaging them in actual on-field engagement with the seagrass meadows through snorkel sites. And finally, establishing a long-term monitoring program for seagrass habitats. And this has come through the empowerment and the capacity development of existing NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the Seychelles, in undertaking how is it you do map seagrass and how is it you do carbon coring. But that said, this is a longer-term commitment and a need for longer-term investment. It must be noted that there has been a start with building the capacity of the carbon inventory team in order for them to be able to subsequently include this information in the carbon inventory. So thinking about 2022 and beyond, Seychelles now is thinking about exactly how the implementation of these commitments will take place once there is a validated map of seagrass meadows in the Seychelles. There are thoughts around capacity building, the need for infrastructure and equipment, and of course, if this is going to go beyond the life of a grant, sustainable finance. So this is where we are in the Seychelles, thinking about Blue Forest and its inclusion in our NDCs beyond just words in the document, but actual implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. That was a really useful presentation, and I particularly appreciate the kind of final note of we need to move from going on paper to how we're going to do real action and make a change. We're going to hear from Angelique in a panel later today about carbon financing, but first we're going to have a panel discussion with Hege and Karen. So please come and join me. Hi, Karen. Welcome back. Okay, let me start with you, Karen. This year, leaders are going to gather in China to finalize and adopt the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It's increasingly acknowledged that climate change and the biodiversity crisis are interlinked. Not all climate change solutions are also solutions for biodiversity crises, but nature-based solutions such as blue forests are referred to as a win-win, in fact, a triple win if you include pollution. Sula mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, but can you please elaborate a little bit more for us?
Yeah, sure. Are you guys getting weird feedback? Or is it just me?
Nope, we hear you really well.
Okay, so just hang on, I need to put my speaker in.
Should I can ask Hege a question first, or you're ready to go? Right,
So
the triple win.
One of the main ways that, yeah, I was getting myself in my ear. I was not going to be able to answer very fluently. But one of the main ways that we can use nature-based solutions for climate change is actually to, restore areas, protect areas, or sustainably manage them. We also know that one of the main threats for biodiversity loss is the loss of habitats, such as blue forests. So any effort to reduce our net carbon emissions that also increases our ecosystems is a win-win, where you have benefits to biodiversity as well as benefits for carbon. And on top of that, actually one of the drivers of our current biodiversity crisis and even extinction crisis is climate change. So these are incredibly interlinked points. But I think just to go a little bit further, it's important when you start thinking about nature-based solutions that restoring a natural ecosystem or protecting a natural ecosystem, if you wanted to look at the benefits from a biodiversity perspective, is always going to be better than, say, putting in an artificial reef or potentially doing something, say, with a seaweed farm. So there's certain types of actions that you can take that are going to be better for biodiversity.
Thank you, Karen. That was really useful. And I like your point about not everything gives the same knock-on benefits to other ecosystems. Now, Hege, we saw with the NDCs for Seychelles, and we're seeing just in general with, for example, the pledge for 30% by 30 when it comes to protecting the oceans, that there's a lot of talk now about protecting our coastal ecosystems and a lot of talk about marine protected areas. Are they the answer for blue forests?
Creating MPAs is part of the answer, and it's extremely important to make a lot of these MPAs all over the world. It's not the entire solution. What is there's a lot you actually gain from the MPEs, and that is you avoid many of the local threats that is in the particular area. So if you protect it against human activities and construction and all these activities that is in that area, it's very important. But you should not be blind to these MPAs because there's no need to set off an area to protect some species if the ultimate cause of the problem is created somewhere else. For instance, on land, for instance, by agriculture or sewage and these things. So do not be blind to just protect. There is much more that is needed.
Thank you. I think that's really a good point. We have to take it with a bit of grain of salt. So Karen, I want to bring us back to your PowerPoint slide on the ways that the carbon capturing potential of the different blue forest ecosystems. You had some really, really great numbers, and I'm sure several of us took like a photo of all of those to remember. But what would you say the key takeaway message is? Just how important are blue forests for climate change? Is it really a big enough ecosystem and a big enough benefit that they warrant being prioritized for restoration and protection?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first off, the science shows that these ecosystems are clearly capturing and storing significant amounts of carbon on a global level. But especially when you look at how much a single hectare or a small area of blue forest can store carbon, that's where those numbers become quite high when you compare them to other ecosystems that we have. And when you start to look at how some of those numbers pan out on a national scale, so for some countries that have substantial blue forests and blue carbon habitats, those national numbers can be relevant for their total carbon emissions. But clearly, of course, we know that blue forests need to be part of a number. They're not going to be the only solution for climate change. They need to be part of a suite of solutions to mitigate climate change. But I think one of the most exciting things about blue carbon and how it relates to blue forests is that it's almost an entry point. But there are so many more co-benefits to protecting these ecosystems than just the carbon. And we've already heard today, but we know that they're supporting high biodiversity. We know they're cycling nutrients. They're supporting coastal fisheries, protection. So all of these other co-benefits are currently not really being captured in a traditional blue carbon credit, but you're still getting those as well when you protect and store these ecosystems. And we sort of see the science moving more and more to valuing all these benefits and looking much more cohesively at how we should be prioritizing our actions and our management strategies for different ecosystems.
Thanks, Karen. I think I agree, and it's nice to see more and more people are talking about you can't look at things in silos. you have to look at it holistically, and then is when you'll know what the best method is. Just a small follow-up question for you before I go back to Hege, because there's a question that came in through Slido, and the question is, are blue carbon numbers inclusive of sediment? I guess maybe they're trying to distinguish between the carbon in the stock versus the carbon it sequesters long term.
Are blue carbon numbers inclusive of the sediment? Yeah, so what those carbon measures are actually counting is the amount for like the soil cores is the amount of carbon that is entering that system every year. So that doesn't necessarily, that's not just like the carbon from, say, the mangrove, that can be the carbon from the surrounding environment that is being stored in the sediment and in the ecosystem as a whole. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. All right, another question for you, Hege. As we mentioned, it is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And are we on a path to have good restoration methods that we can prove are really going to work and are cost effective to scale up? And if so, what is important to consider when undertaking restoration projects from a scientist's perspective?
Well, we do have some really good techniques and results and examples from some of the blue forests, like the mangroves. I think we are there to be able to scale it up, and we have the right techniques. For the other ones, maybe also for saltmarshes, we have some good techniques. When it comes to the seagrass, we really don't. And there is a lot of examples where there are successful restoration, and a lot of examples where they do exactly the same, just another place, another year, and it's not successful. So we have to find out what are the criteria for successful stories or restoration stories and what are not. And especially when it comes to the kelp restoration, we are in the very beginning of trying to find out how to restore. But mostly, in most areas, the kelp will actually restore itself if the conditions are in place, and that's the last part of the question. What is needed? Then we have to know exactly what conditions are important for that species, and if it's present in the area we want to restore. And for the case of this green gravel I was talking about, it looks beautiful. You can put it out, and maybe it also recruits first year and it looks great, but maybe the next year again it's not there anymore because the ultimate cause of problem is not dealt with. So yeah.
So a real focus on making sure that the conditions are ripe for restoration.
Yes.
And I guess it brings it back to your key point too as well about protection is more cost effective. So let's keep the blue forests we have. And I think that's a good message. Karen, just back to you again. You there's a question here about you had a little slide about how blue forests are not just important for capturing carbon, so the mitigation side, but also the adaptation side as well. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so I think a really good example there is the coastal protection that a lot of blue forests can provide. So, for example, if you have floods or sea level rise or something, and you don't have anything in your coastal zone, often that additional water can just go right into infrastructure and can be very damaging and very costly. So having a natural forest, this is a natural-based solution to these problems, can actually buffer the effects of some of these extreme events. So we know that climate change is causing increasing extreme events. We know that all of these things are projected to become more frequent and more severe in many places. So making sure that there's a buffer along the coastlines can really reduce the vulnerability and increase the resilience of communities to these events.
Thank you, Karen. And I think we have time for one last question for you, Hege. You mentioned the conditions have to be right, but one of the key threats to blue forest is climate change, and that's normally beyond the scope of a project implementer to solve the climate, unfortunately. Is there anything that we can do to reduce the effects of climate change on blue forests in terms of mitigation and adaptation? Or do we just have to accept that they're going to keep destroying our blue forests?
We have to keep fighting against the climate change, of course, but we cannot expect the results or the effect of those in the immediate future. So we have to do something else. Yes. I have one example maybe from kelp, that if you can't fight or mitigate the climate changes, then you maybe have to adapt to them. And when it comes to kelp, there are studies or projects going on where they try to find out which genes in a certain species that are mostly adapted to temperature, to high temperature, for instance. So that could be one way to adapt to the climate crisis. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have, which is a shame. There's questions coming in, but the Hege at least will be available in the break as well. So please thank you to Hege and Karen for participating in this panel discussion. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Peter Haugan, who will be moderating the remainder of today's program.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cecilia, and thank you all for contributing so far. We still have 3 more talks in stock for you and a final panel debate, and we're actually going to bring back Angelique to the final panel debate as well. And we are moving ahead with climate and into valuation and into looking at how can we deal with these issues. So you are now well trained in the natural science of kelps and blue forest, and now we're going to see how can we deal with this and how can we value it. So the first talk here is from Ralph from the international, who has a long experience from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, is a financial economist, and has been known to make a lot of contributions in this exactly valuation of natural capital. So this is not only about the money flows that we know in terms of production and economy, but the valuation of natural capital. We're going to hear more about that. So his talk first is about blue carbon finance.
Good morning, everyone. I first would like to thank the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation for giving me the chance to present a new framework that is nature-based and would lead to sustainable and shared development. At COP26, there was a realization that we are facing 2 risks. Not only climate change risk, but natural capital risk and the loss of biodiversity. These 2 are linked together through human activity. How did we get here? Well, that's because the current paradigm believes and acts as if the economy is outside of nature. That means we can extract with impunity, we can pollute with impunity, and as we're finding out that such behavior is unsustainable and has led to the climate change risk, which is boomeranging back to us in terms of the loss of natural capital and its biodiversity. Obviously, this behavior is unsustainable. So what is the true paradigm, if you like? Well, it's the one we've always known, our ancestors used to know, and somehow we managed to forget that nature is our home. Our economies, our societies are all nested inside of nature, which means if nature grows, we grow, and if nature is stressed, we are stressed. So nature is macrocritical to us, not only to our health, but also to the sustainabilities of our economic system. So how do we act on that? Well, we start with science. Science tells us that, for example, the oceans, 4/5 of the planet, are also incredibly important to us. For example, they capture so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Science also tells us that the great whales in the oceans also help to sequester carbon, be it on their body or indirectly through their fertilization of the phytoplankton. Science also tells us that their cousins on land, these are the forest elephants in Africa, also help to sequester carbon not only on their body, but in the forests, in the trees in the forests of Africa. Science also tells us that the blue carbon assets such as salt marshes, seagrass, mangroves, kelp forests, and so forth also help sequester significant amounts of carbon and also provide other ecosystem services just like the other species and I've discussed before, such as in terms of defense against flooding, and they lead to greater fish stocks. So science is really telling us that biodiversity is valuable. That is, a biodiversity of a living and thriving nature is incredibly valuable to us. We can also value those services that nature provides. So if you look at the value of carbon sequestration by a single whale, that's over $2 million. We can also value the carbon services of a single elephant in Africa, and that's also over $1.75 million. We can also value the carbon services of seagrass, for example, and that's over $1.2, $1.3 trillion. So science tells us nature is valuable. We can actually do the market valuation of these services. But in order to create markets and economies around nature, we also need the policy action. What ought to be the policy action? Well, we first need to set the legal framework around the legal rights of nature, around the protection of nature, around the monitoring of nature, around the management of nature. Once we have that, once we have the science, we have the valuation, we have the legal framing, then those that are sitting on all of that natural capital can then move all of this natural assets to natural capital, to financial capital that can now enter their balance sheets and therefore change their net worth. Once this is done, then the markets will take notice that there's a new class of assets around which they can build services. So in the case of carbon, those that have the natural capital that can sequester carbon can sell the services, not the assets themselves, to those that need to offset their carbon footprint, such that the money that comes in from the sale of the carbon offsets should come in under two principles. One, that the money looks after the natural assets in perpetuity, be it whales, be it elephants, be it trees or mangroves and so forth. And two, that the money goes to look after the stewards of nature in perpetuity through meaningful employment and income, stabilizing them in their lands, and these would be the local communities and the indigenous population. Thank you for your attention.
So, thanks to Ralph Chami for that overview. I hope you're with us. This is a complicated area when it comes to legal rules and enforcement and so on. But he talks about the value of natural capital. We are not going to follow up too much on whales and elephants in this seminar, but we are going to go back to blue forests. And our next speaker is Stephen Lutz. He works at the Grid Arendal. He has been around with he's the blue carbon lead there. He's been around with this area for quite a while and has a broad overview. And he's going to talk to us about harnessing the value of blue carbon. Please.
Hi there. I'm going to jump right into it because I've got quite a bit to cover, but thank you very much to all the organizers and everybody here. Thank you. Just press that. Anyway, so there's many different ways to recognize and harness the value of blue carbon in policy and management and in different types of mechanisms or schemes. The ones I'm going to be talking about today are in national policy and in carbon finance. But like I said, there's many different ways. At the beginning of the days in blue carbon, we all thought we were going to be blue carbon millionaires with blue carbon finance, but that's been taken a while to develop. It seems like there's a rapid uptick now. But there's many different ways to get to our goals of mitigation of climate change, sustainable coastal communities, or the conservation and restoration of these ecosystems. And what I'm presenting today is the lessons learned from the UN Environment's Blue Forests project, which was a large-scale global initiative to explore how to harness blue carbon and other ecosystem benefits with multiple project sites across the globe, which has just closed down, and we're looking at the lessons learned in developing these experiences. I was the coordinator of this project on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme, which also received quite a bit of co-finance from the Norwegian government. Thank you very much. Okay, so one of those project sites was in the United Arab Emirates, and at this project site, we looked at exploring the value of carbon in mangroves, seagrasses, saltwater marshes, and a couple other local ecosystems like coastal sabkha and algal mats. So like what Angelique explained in the Seychelles, they did this for the whole range of blue carbon ecosystems in the UAE. And we also looked at the viability of carbon finance. It was not viable, but what we did do there, or what the Emiratis did, is they were able to take that value of blue carbon and recognize it in policy at multiple levels. So in municipal planning, in emirate level policy, and all the way up to national climate commitments, and including it in the UAE's nationally determined contribution. Okay, so there's many different ways. And also through the Blue Forest Project, we looked at things like exploring how Mozambique's National Mangrove Management Plan could incorporate the value of blue carbon to help support existing policies. Okay, and this is where, over the past few years, most of where blue carbon has had its impact on conservation and management is through existing policies. Okay, I don't have to go into this too much because I think Ralph just explained basically what the carbon market is. But just to say that some key facts about the carbon market are additionality, the requirement that emissions reductions would not happen without the incentive of the carbon credits. So you have to say that I'm going to protect these mangroves that were threatened. But if they're already going to be protected, you really can't claim that as additional. Leakage, that the activity creating the emissions does not simply transfer outside of the project bounds. So if I'm going to cut down this mangrove here and they protected it, then I'm not going to go someplace else outside the project bounds and do the same activity. And then quantification, and that's the accurate measurements of greenhouse gas reductions and removals from the project through project verification and validation. Okay? Now I'm going to describe quickly a voluntary carbon market blue carbon project. And this is a community-based project. Its name is Mikoko Pamoja, which means mangroves together in Swahili. This is the world's first working blue carbon community-based voluntary carbon market project. It contributed to the Blue Forest project, and it is community-led. Okay? The project site is in coastal Kenya, just south of Mombasa, and the mangrove area that's included in the voluntary carbon offsetting is 107 hectares, okay? And within that, there's a plantation of casuarina trees to offset the cutting that was happening in the mangrove forest. That's how they're addressing the leakage issue, okay? What are the key results of this project? Well, carbon that's been sold into the voluntary carbon market following the Plan Vivo standards, and that's the accreditation for the carbon offsetting, is around 2,000 to 3,000 tons per year since its start in 2014, and it's generated from 11,000 at the beginning up to $22,000 per annum for this community. To support the project activities. And there's 5 communities that benefit from this. This project is viewed as successful by the Kenyan government, as being replicated throughout Kenya. Okay. Project activities, as I mentioned, are the reforestation of degraded mangrove areas and the avoided deforestation of existing mangrove areas that were under threat. In other words, conservation and reforestation. And through this project also, they support other things that the community can benefit from. So for example, it's connected to the ecotourism venture, the Women's Mangrove Boardwalk that you were shown the video of. And also the profits from this project go into the community. So beyond the funds that are necessary for the conservation and restoration, profits go directly into the community. Okay? And this includes stuff like the purchasing of school books for local children, for local schools, and the repair of school houses, or the roofs of school houses. Okay? The building of water tanks, and water pumps, and the creation of water points, which means that the communities no longer have to use ropes down long wells. It means that there's lower costs and improved health to communities, and also it means that it frees up it addresses some gender issues, because a lot of the members of the community that were collecting water were actually the women in the community, which means they have a lot less time to be devoted to that, so they can devote it to other things that they may want to. Okay. And here's the crux of the sort of matter, is the negotiated financial flow. And so here we have the negotiated financial flow for Mikoko Pomoja. And please note here, the external buyer of the carbon credits comes in, carbon brokerage. Now the carbon brokerage for Mikoko Pomoja is a group called ACES out of Scotland. They take 0% of the cut of that money coming in and going to the community. The Kenyan government, the Forestry Service, took 0% from that project as well. So essentially what you have here is only 6% is needed for the project verification and validation. It's easy to access that area, and the rest of it can go towards operation of the project and profit and the mitigation activities. Plan Vivo requires that 60% of the revenue be distributed to its project partners. So this is how we're able to achieve all of those positive things for the community. However, it's not always that case. So one of our other explorations was in Madagascar. And here, the National Red Office says, basically, you have to give 27% of any red project to the National Red Office, okay? Plan Vivo says 60% to the community, which leaves 13% for verification and validation. This has been found to be insufficient to cover those costs, because it's very difficult to access these areas in Madagascar. So Blue Ventures, our project coordinator, is having to cover these costs by alternative means. That's not entirely sustainable. So these questions that have to be asked and answered with regard to these types of projects. Okay, and another thing coming up, hold on, is recently, and this is since November of last year, the price of carbon offsets has skyrocketed. And myself personally, I know many in the blue carbon community have been approached by carbon brokers looking to secure the rights to blue carbon ecosystems, to the blue carbon benefits, to secure those rights so that they can make maximum profit. Okay? The deals that they're offering are not the deals that you've seen in Mikoko Pomoja. They'd like to have at least 50% of the profit themselves, or 100% of the profit themselves. Okay, so we've got some interesting questions to ask. But what this is also mean is that this is very exciting, because there's potential for large amounts of money to go into the conservation and restoration of these ecosystems like we've never seen before. Okay. And this is the last question, and I'm going to bring up what Ian said, is that there have been some questions about, well, what are the potential socioeconomic impacts of these types of projects? This is an assessment of ecosystem services from 2014. And back then, carbon sequestration was just seen as a tiny, small wedge. But now that it's increasing in value, it's going to increase in value, and it means it's going to offset these other values in a coastal community. It has the potential to do that through the voluntary carbon market globally. We can do it right, or we can have more lessons. And I think what Ian presented on the seaweed aquaculture, we have to take those lessons and learn. And we've looked at this a wee bit through the Blue Forest project, but this stuff, the carbon market is very recent. But we did look at this, and we developed something called the Blue Carbon Code of Conduct. Okay, and it's guidelines for developing projects to have socially just and equitable outcomes. But I do believe that the blue carbon community and the market really need to pay more attention to that type of an issue. It's coming. It's going to have a big impact. Let's do it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I have a number of questions, but I'll hold on till we get to the panel debate at the end here. Many interesting issues here, specific examples and how to validate and verify and so on. We're going to get back to that. Our final speaker before the panel debate is Firdaus Agung. He is from the Indonesian government and it's actually quite interesting and it's a pilot project he's going to talk about because they are actually going into this with ocean accounting in a very specific way, and they are going to try and make that happen. So, final speaker Firdaus Agung on ocean accounting in Blue Forest in Indonesia.
Good morning. My name is Firdaus Agung from the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Indonesia. It is my pleasure to be invited and give a presentation for this very important webinar. The management of our MPA has been very challenging for the last 2 decades due to the increase of climate change impacts. The management unit has to respond to dynamic environmental conditions that affect their MPA ecosystem. The challenge is enormous, not only because its potential impacts to local community living around the MPA, but also how the management unit can respond and even prepare for the better management. How ocean account and MPA management are interrelated in our pilot. This can be seen from 3 different contexts. Indonesian MPA is a multi-purpose protected area where certain uses are still permitted with strict rules. How we can monitor the activities and its impacts are critical to the successful management of the MPA. As activities will not only generate socio-economic benefit, including in these cases food and jobs for the locals, but also flow of residual or pollutants to MPA ecosystem. Management of MPA mostly rely on its zoning and applied rule and regulation within the zones. We need to know exactly the ecosystem asset distribution, services, and its changes over time and over space. The sustainable use and zoning context management then rely on the capacity to regulate the individual activity inside the MPA, including product and services used, and type and amount of residual produced. The ocean account result then or potentially used as input for other technical management intervention in the context of MPA effective management. These include the benefit cost analysis, performance indicator, and payment for environmental services to support the MPA effective management evaluation. The pilot was undertaken at Kalimatra MPA, which is located close to Bali, around 30 minutes flying from Denpasar Airport. It has 3 small islands with total coverage of 2.9 thousand hectares and composed by 3 major zones, namely core zone, utilization zone, and sustainable fisheries zone. From 7 accounts within the ocean account framework, we piloted the first account, the ocean asset. We measure mangrove, seagrass, and coral reef extent, condition, and monetary value. Other account was also produced, but using limited primary data. From this opening and closing table, we can see the change in ocean asset of the MPA. We can see there is a decrease of coral reef, primarily, which is caused by coral bleaching a few years ago, and then increase of seagrass extent with major major addition coming from the change of other substrate to seagrass, and decrease in mangrove extent with major reduction coming from land use change from mangrove into other use. Management need to respond and evaluate the changes and its impact to MPA function. But at least he or she knows exactly what changes and where that changes take place. Using two different data from 2020 and 2021, we also produce a map that shows the distribution of MP ecosystem value changes in monetary term. In general, there is an increase in the value of the ecosystem around 40%. But it is necessary to pay attention to which ecosystem function are increasing. And the spatial distribution of the ecosystem value is related to the zoning of the area. So, as a closing, the pilot demonstrated that ocean account as potential tools to improve the management of MPA in Indonesia by showing the change of ecosystem assets and condition and its spatial distribution during the reporting period. Ocean account helps management unit to monitor and respond to the impact of human activities and climate change, which affect MPA ecosystem extent, condition, and services. The right response and management policy will keep the MPA works and delivers its services to sustain livelihood and preserve biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks to Firdaus. And I think this is quite a bold activity they are undertaking. They are actually going in a limited area which requires detailed data. They are looking at changes from one year to another, and it's really a pilot activity. This ocean accounting is something that is coming up. We have, over the last year, on the UN level, developed standards for how to do this with the environmental accounting, and it's something that many have big expectations to in the future, but it requires a lot of work, I think, from the statistical agencies and so on of the countries to make this happen in a good way. Okay, stay put. We are now into the final session of this whole day. And we're going to have a panel debate. We are going to bring back Angelique Pouponneau, who gave a talk earlier, I think. And we are also going to bring in Kirsten Isense, who you haven't seen earlier today. And we are also going to bring up Stephen Lutz here on the stage with me and entertain a discussion of many of the things we've heard today and how we can move into the future. And again, we take in questions from the audience through Slido, as mentioned before. So to get this all started, I'd like to go to Kirsten first. Kirsten Isense. She is a program specialist at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, headquartered in Paris, which is the sort of science organization in the UN when it comes to the ocean. And Kirsten, I hope you have been able to listen into this. I think you did intend to listen into this morning, and maybe I can start with you in terms of what do we know about the science of blue forests in terms of carbon, but also more generally. Can you say something about how uncertain are we on this? We had a talk earlier by Karen Philby-Dexter on some of this, but do we know these blue forests? Do you know how to deal with them from a science perspective?
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be with you here today, and thanks for the invitation. So I think we came a long way in terms of science when we started in 2010 with the Blue Carbon Initiative together with Conservation International and IUCN. There was not so much known about the science, and far less was known on how to communicate the science to the policymakers, and we really came a long way. We know now that the sequestration rates are extremely high in those classical blue carbon ecosystems. We know where it's stored, and we know how much is also emitted, at least at global levels. I think we are still missing a lot of local capacity to actually do the work then, to get the numbers, the concrete numbers from the places where we want to have a blue carbon intervention. We still don't know how to account, for example, and how to translate the knowledge we have about kelp forest seaweed in the UNFCCC. It's not yet there. We just this week's report on from the IPCC showed again the importance of blue carbon ecosystems in terms of carbon, but also in terms of the other additional services. However, I think there's a need to qualify those methodologies. What was said before, it's nothing new I'm saying here, but to have cheaper ways to do that, still very costly human-wise and technology-wise, to then really have this equally distributed, and that it's not a few experts in the world who have to travel around to actually help countries to do that. And that is where we are right now. And we are not only in the decade of restoration, we are also in the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And there, I think we have a possibility to increase our scientific knowledge, but also the scientific capacity, which then can inform the policy to take action.
Yeah, exactly. So this decade is also about science to inform policy and action. So we are going to get to these interlinkages between policy, science, and action here in various ways. And also the broader issues of blue forest, as was mentioned already this morning by Solrun, you know, for food, for environment, for biodiversity, for climate. They all things linked together. But if we stay on climate for a little while more, I'd like to come back to Angelique and maybe Stephen on this. You talked about nationally determined contributions, Angelique, and Stephen talked about also the voluntary carbon market, and we can also then discuss methodology. Maybe you first, Angelique, in case people haven't really got the difference between the nationally determined contributions and voluntary trading in carbon markets. Can you say something about how you feel that your work on that and when getting finance, how new and uncertain are these methodologies, and how certain do you feel about the methodologies to validate what you have been doing?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. In terms of just the question of methodologies, these are things that we are now exploring. Before, it was really trying to understand the assets that we have so that we can better manage them. The next step, of course, is to understand what are the financing opportunities, and there are several. And we've spoken about the voluntary carbon markets. We've got sort of en vivo, so the methodologies that are in place. We've got climate finance through the more traditional routes, or I would say sort of green climate fund. So there's an array of options. One of the things that Seychelles has managed to do with that is we've engaged with, again, one of the very few carbon markets experts, and we've engaged with them to explore what kind of financing mechanism can we put in place. Because one of the things that we have to, of course, deal with is where does the money come from? And we've heard through previous presentations, there are investors who are looking for a return that, you know, to a developing country may feel like we are selling our assets, rather than having a fair deal. So we are mindful of those challenges that we have at hand, but exploring what other options do we have? So we do have at the moment a design, well, in fact, yes, a design of what could be a seagrass conservation pool, with multiple sources of funding that would be channeled through that pool and then rechanneled to seagrass ecosystem conservation and management. But these are things that are still at design phase. They do, of course, have to work with the methodologies that exist. We are exploring which one is best to explore and approach. And then from there, we probably have something more concrete to share once we've gone into what is the next phase.
So thank you very much. I mean, I'm impressed. This is work in progress. We have to develop the tools as we go along, and at the same time, it's an urgent issue. So we really need to do this. And And that's why I'm sort of always thinking about how do we make these policy action and science happen in the right tempo, if you wish. But Stephen, maybe you want to comment on this as well.
Sure. And one thing just to say is that the brokers that are looking for these projects are realizing that these projects don't exist. Okay, there's a great demand for your blue carbon offsets, but there's not a lot of projects that are on the ground. Maybe that's a good thing as we work out these sort of methodologies for project implementation. Now, the Green Climate Fund and the GEF were mentioned. GEF's also already funded some of this work. But you could look at this as that these projects, these types of community-based voluntary carbon market projects, and I know there's other types of projects, they take about 2 to 3 years to set up. Okay, maybe you could use conservation funds to set that up and support the sustainability, the long-term sustainability of those projects from the voluntary carbon market. You could also look at, is replicating a non-profit brokerage the way to go for these projects to maximize social benefits? Technology could be included, drones to reduce the cost of verification and validation. Also, maybe even apps. Is it possible to have a Tibber, which is what we use in Norway to reduce our energy costs, that community-based carbon offset projects could use to maximize profit to the community? Anyway, just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's certainly important, perspectives. Another question that comes to mind. I mean, I hear about some projects. We heard about the Mikoko Pomoya. We heard about a couple, and they are quite impressive. And there are more projects, I know, but nevertheless, there's a limited number, as you also said, Stephen, and there's a limited number of people at the moment having benefit from these projects. And we have a huge problem to solve. We know that Blue Forest can't solve all the carbon uptake that is needed in the future, but it can solve a certain part. But still, there's a long way to go from the size of the existing project, the number of hectares, to where we need to go in order to have protection. How can we sort of make sure that the speed is commensurate with the needs for this kind of thing? Stephen again.
Okay, so I mentioned a couple sort of technology issues, but I think one of the key things here, as Angela spoke of, she said that they consulted with one of the few carbon market experts. So we need more regional and national expertise and capacity in these types of projects. And we need that capacity to be kept within regions. Because if you have a regional approach to this, you'll actually have more buy-in and more sharing, more education, more upscaling potential, as opposed to just sending around experts from Western countries to developed countries all the time. Mm-hmm. That's my quick answer to that one.
Yeah. Kirsten, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I also mentioned that before. I really think this capacity development part is very important, and also to get those projects, as Steve said, they are not there yet, but there are some new initiatives which are out there to try to get this to this investment ready stage. So there are some financial ways where countries can support those and really seeing it as an investment in the future without direct return. And I think that is where we have to work together more globally, and also really sharing those lessons learned and also sharing the bad lessons learned. And I think that's we always all prefer to sell only the good stories, but having some go-to places where one can easily access information. One big quick point for me as well is open access to data. It's something which is not only true for blue carbon ecosystems, but in general, I think we have to increase our capacity as well to evaluate this data, having appropriate metadata and data to really be able to identify the quality of the measured carbon stocks, and then also how we can account for it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I know open access is a difficult issue sometimes in development-related activities, but Angelique.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's an important question. And I mean, sitting here sort of
from a developing country, one of the things, and it's across the board, right? This is from the very design of the project, and that's something that we always need to think about. Oftentimes, and you would have seen with my presentation, and it was intentional that I started with the number of partners that were on this initiatives to support the government of Seychelles. And they were a mixture of international and local partners. But what's important in designing the project is always in the how. I think it's, we shouldn't get just bogged down to the blue carbon science or structuring blue carbon deals, but how are we doing it? How are we doing it in a way that is actually empowering the communities? How are we doing it in a way that is developing capacity? Because what we find is, without thinking about that, there is a dependency that is created. So we're always looking outwards to figure out how to manage our own assets, which is crazy, because we already have so much local knowledge and traditional knowledge to understand and these assets and these ecosystems. When we're thinking about blue carbon financing, and this has been the case, I mean, Seychelles is a country that has enormous experience with testing innovation. But one of the things that we found is that it's always very much linked to external experts coming in to assist us with structuring deals, with thinking through those deals. And I think it's always important to appreciate that, whilst I won't generalize, there's always a power imbalance in many respects, right? Because you're considered a beneficiary of the deal as opposed to an active agent, an active participant of the deal. And then one of the things that we found extremely helpful is avoid parachute science at all costs. So this isn't a matter of Western consultants, Western partners flying in, undertaking science, and then telling us, here is the 101010101. No, we need to have capacity build alongside, but then also be able to understand the data that we have collected and then understand how we interpret it to use it to inform our policies. And I think that's very important, that we don't take it at any one point. This has to be from design and felt and mainstream throughout the entire process to reaping the benefits of whatever financial mechanism we can then explore. Thank you.
And then you need to make sure that you have the possibility to keep that expertise and that capacity in your countries, right? So
Sure.
That's also an issue here. And again, I'm fascinated by this. You mentioned, Stephen, this kind of price increase, and then I immediately also think about this blue neo-colonialism that Ian mentioned earlier. Are we getting there? Are we getting there with farming, with kelp or seaweed farming? But are we also getting there with these projects that deal with the natural blue forest? And there's an opportunity, but there's also a danger in this. And how can we make sure we get our act together and have the right players for that? We have only 2 minutes left, so I think with that I'll let you all have a very quick final comment, starting with Kirsten, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very important to be very, very strict in not underselling the blue carbon ecosystems right now, and working on Article 6 of the UNFCCC, on which a lot of this is based, a lot of how to do that correctly, but then also really helping to implement and also say stop. I think we saw a lot of goodwill at UNFCCC, but it's really for international organizations, NGOs as well, to guide those, to provide the best practices to do that correctly and not let them, they mean well, but sometimes, as you said, it might not result in the good result. So I think it's for us as well to be very proactive and guide them to do it correctly.
Angelique, very quickly, a final word. We're losing your sound.
A final word is just to say, just because people sort of turn up at the door with lots of money, let's be cautious and let's make sure that we're fair to ourselves going forward.
Thank you. Stephen?
And I'd like to say that, beyond, I think the international community of NGOs have shown a great way forward with advancing blue carbon. But also, we have to respect the rights of sovereign nations and maybe allow them to talk to each other to share these experiences unfiltered or influenced by other sort of influences. And getting back to what you said about the sort of ocean grabbing, well, there actually was a protest on blue carbon at the Paris COP. It's called Ocean Grabbing in Disguise. And that's what stimulated us to put something together like the Code of Conduct. We do have lessons learned, and we'd love to share them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll give the panel a big hand and then go to the final session. Thank you very much. And then I'll invite my co-organizers back on the stage to final words.
So now it's time to wrap up. And I would like to start by asking Cecilia and Peter, what are the two main key takeaways from this seminar?
I think for me, it's urgency, the urgent need to stop and ideally reverse the decline of blue forests, the urgent need to scale up research on what works, what doesn't work, and lessons learned when it comes to protecting and restoring and replacing our blue forests, and the urgent need to make sure that this growing, booming blue carbon market actually goes in the right way. And there are lessons we can learn from REDD+ and land-based projects as well, and I really hope that we do.
Peter?
Well, I support that, but I think also the possibilities that we have for moving fast here are immense. But they require a very tight interaction between science, policy, and action that we just talked about. That we move, in parallel and advance the knowledge that is needed, and don't let lack of knowledge stop us from starting and trying, because we need to experiment with these systems and these ways of making the funding coming to the right projects and so on. And I mean, I'm coming from a long interest in sustainability, and it's characteristic by being very, very broad and interacting and so on. But I think that's also the case here. We should not look at only one aspect of blue forest. We should look at how they interact, and then this way of win-win-win solutions and no regret solutions. I'm sure there are many of those out there that we can implement immediately and then build up as we go along. A lot of opportunities.
So I'm giving myself the opportunity to also have two takeaways from today's seminar. I'm just going to echo and agree with both Cecilia and Peter. I think the whole thing about actually trying to do that kind of inclusive processes from the beginning, no matter what we're doing, if it's on a project level, if it's on a municipality level, or if it's in a national level. I think this is something that's really important for all international development partners. That is government donors, that is international NGOs, local NGOs, also for that matter, the World Bank, the FAO, and all UNEP, and all the other organizations working on these issues, because there's quite few. And then the other takeaway is how you actually do that kind of cross-sectoral approach, and that you have to really take some time and figure out how that is done in the best manner, where you're supposed to work. And that can actually really differ from one part to another in the same municipality, for that sense. So really look at the local the local structures and the setups, and who is actually having the management role, and which groups are sort of the ones that you should involve, starting right in the beginning, not later. But with that, I would like to thank all speakers and all moderators and all participants here in the room and also viewing digitally. So with that, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.